How much do you know about Antarctica? Welcome to the Everything Antarctica podcast, where your hosts Maddie Jordan and Johnny Harrison will answer all of your questions. We'll talk to globally recognised experts, discuss current affairs, news, and ultimately highlight why Antarctica should matter to you. Come on a journey as we unpack everything you've ever wondered about the world's most extreme environment. Welcome to another episode of the Everything Antarctica podcast. I'm your host, Maddie Jordan. I'm joined by my co-host, Johnny Harrison. And today we're doing an intro to ice. It's an Ice 101. So we're going to talk about a lot of different types of ice that we have in Antarctica, because there are quite a few depending on where they are and how they form. So we'll kick off with that. We'll just preface this by saying that neither Johnny or I are ice experts. So we're not glaciologists or anything like that. If there are any out there that want to come and talk to us about ice, then please feel free to come and do that. We're also happy to be corrected as well. So this is just an elementary dive into the different types of ice. So do you maybe want to kick us off, Johnny, and we'll start with the biggest type of ice, which is the ice sheet.
Yeah, so I think the ice sheet needs to be bigger than 50,000 square kilometres in size, and that is ice that is found over the top of landmass. So that's essentially stuck on top of the land. So think bigger than a glacier, bigger than an ice cap. It's pretty much the biggest amount of ice, and I think the only two spaces that currently have ice sheets is Antarctica and Greenland.
Correct. Yeah, so that's the big picture stuff. When you look at a map of Antarctica, everything that's in the middle that typically ends up feeding all of the glaciers as it comes down off the polar plateau. So ice sheets are the biggest forms of ice that we've got in Antarctica. And
then from there, so the ice sheet then goes down, and a lot of people don't really know, but there's a great deal of mountains and quite a bit of land that's underneath all of the ice. So everyone just thinks that it's ice, but it's actually resting on a continental mass. And when it gets down to the water level, if essentially the glacier then comes out and goes over the top and sits on top of that water, we know that as an ice shelf. Near where we were hanging out, near Scott Base, there's the Ross ice shelf, which is bigger than the size of France. And what other ice shelves do we have in Antarctica?
Some of the bigger ice shelves that we've got, the Ross ice shelf, the Filchner-Ronne ice shelf, and the Larsen ice shelf. They're ones that we often hear scientists talking about because they're interested in the studies around those. But there are plenty of other ones that exist in Antarctica, and it's not just limited to Antarctica. So there are ice shelves that exist in Greenland and Russia and another number of other countries in the Arctic as well.
Yeah, cool. And then I guess the other side of things that we are often quite impacted by at Scott Base anyway in particular is the sea ice, right?
Yeah, so the sea ice is differentiated away from the ice shelves and ice sheets because the sea ice is seasonal and it is actually frozen ocean. So it's the ocean ends up freezing throughout the winter period when it starts getting cold, and it's not actually situated on top of land, so that can come and go, whereas the ice shelves and the ice sheets are typically pretty stable.
Yeah, so you've got the ice sheet, which if you think about it, like if you're in bed, you're pulling the ice sheet up and over on top of you. It's like the land mass has a big sheet over the top of it, and then it sits down at the end of the bed and it kind of like flows out over the top of the water, so that's like a shelf because it's sort of sitting there attached to the bit over the land, so it's still sort of being fed from that by gravity, and then you end up having the sea ice, as you say, kind of often will meet up against that, and that'll form throughout the winter. That freezes up as the temperatures drop, and that's salt water, so that's not fresh water. So we typically sort of say that it's kind of the freshwater side of things is the sheet and the ice shelves.
So if we go back to your analogy of pulling a sheet over yourself in bed, is the floor the sea ice?
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, essentially.
If your bed is floating on the ocean,
Yeah.
then everything around you is sea ice.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things is with the ice shelf is there'll be what they call a grounding line. So it's and that's one of the big things that scientists look into, is to actually see where that grounding line is and what's happening underneath the ice, because while the ice thickness is very much important and something that we all need to be concerned about, it's also what's happening underneath there, because obviously you've still got all of this water that essentially this shelf is sitting on top of, in a way, and so what's happening there. And so one of the big things that scientists are trying to figure out is, okay, if we reach that grounding line, what happens then? Do we end up having this runaway effect? Is this the actual thing that's stopping the snow and all the ice and all the ice sheet in behind it from actually flowing off with nothing stopping it? Is that the brakes taken off the whole thing?
Yeah, and what a lot of scientists are saying is that it's the ice shelves that are melting from below due to the warming water of the ocean. So there's an interesting experiment you can do at home with the kids. If you grab 2 glasses of water and you fill one of them with ice and you fill the other one with ice and water, the ice that's inside the cup that's got water in it will melt a whole lot quicker than the ice that doesn't have water in it. So that's just giving you an indication of how these dynamics work in Antarctica. The exact same principle applies as well. So if you've got an ice shelf that's sitting on top of water, it's that water from underneath that will contribute more to the melting of that than the air on the top.
Yeah, totally. And the one thing to note is the thickness, so particularly of the Ross Ice Shelf, can be hundreds of metres thick in places. So we land planes on it, a lot of activity happens on it, and we're not too worried about it in terms of when you're travelling across it, generally speaking, it's fine. You still end up having issues whereby whenever it goes around a landmass, or if we end up having any thin spots in it, you can still end up having a shear or essentially a crevassing effect where it's torn apart, because you've got gravity acting upon this entire massive big piece of ice, and so as it moves and it goes around the islands and all the different bits and topographical features in between it and the sea, as it slowly stretches out, you'll see that it ends up creating all of these pressure points. So there are things that we still need to be cautious of, even if it is still hundreds of metres of thick ice in places.
Yeah, and the other thing that's interesting about an ice shelf is, in a similar way that an ice shelf and the grounding line is holding back the ice sheet, sometimes you get that effect with sea ice and the ice shelf itself. So sometimes what we see out the front of Scott Base is we've got frozen sea ice, and that tends to hold the ice shelf back from calving. But at certain times of the year, and not every year, but some years, we see the sea ice disappear. It blows out from the front of Scott Base, and then the ice shelf has nothing to hold it back from calving, so we do tend to get these massive icebergs that carve off the front of the Ross Ice Shelf in front of base, which is cool to see, and is a pretty natural process as well, so nothing like overly alarming there. But when that does happen and the sea ice blows out, we do tend to see the carry-on effect of the carving of the front of the ice shelf.
Interesting you say there about icebergs, right? And so icebergs are big hunks usually of freshwater ice. They're not seawater ice. So we don't have icebergs formed in the sea ice. So when the sea ice breaks up, and the seasonal sea ice will grow and contract, when that breaks up, and if it ends up blowing out, you'll end up having a whole bunch of these little bits of ice. Still huge chunks of ice, don't get me wrong, but they're far smaller, but they don't have the density and they don't have the depth, the same level as what we have carving off of the side of the ice shelf. So.
Yeah, and while we're talking about icebergs, so people often look at them and they say, well, that's really huge. But the one thing to realise with icebergs is that you're only seeing about 10% of the mass of that entire ice above the surface. So about 90% of an iceberg sits underneath the ocean. So when you're looking at one and you think it's huge, you need to put that in perspective and think about how massive it actually is, because there's so much of it that you can't see.
Yeah, and often we'd find as the sea ice changes and some of those icebergs carve off, you might end up having these icebergs travel up McMurdo Sound and out towards open water, and then sometimes they're so big, as you say, there's so much of them below the waterline that they might end up getting grounded themselves. And so it's not unusual to see, this iceberg got grounded 10 years ago and it's still sitting here, and then one day, okay, yep, sweet, the sea ice goes, and there's enough of it melted out from underneath over the years, and all of a sudden it's gone. So it's a very dynamic situation in that respect.
Yeah.
Another thing that's quite interesting to note is around sea ice. So when we end up having that form and it grows, as Maddie was saying, you'll end up having it, the colder it is, the quicker it will grow. But typically over a season, if you end up having multi-year ice, that ice can also get quite thick. So it's not uncommon to find, a couple of metres thick ice, particularly out the front of Scott Base. But what's interesting around that is as the ice freezes, what happens is the salt content, the brine, essentially gets drawn out from that ice. So when you're looking at the ice, it actually looks blue, no different to that of what you'd expect to see on a glacier, but it's not originally fresh or freshwater ice. It's actually saltwater ice, and the thing is that salt, as it's frozen, as it's cooled, it's extracted out from underneath it. So it's quite interesting to see that. And the other thing is around Scott Base in particular, because you've got this tidal mass of sea ice in behind, what we end up having is what we call pressure ridges. So as all of this ice forms and freezes, and then the tide goes up and down, and the tide sort of moves in and out. And so we have these low pressure points right where it hits usually where it hits the land, and so when that happens, it'll buckle and it'll end up coming up, and so we end up having all of these essentially these giant monoliths of ice out the front of Scott Base, which is just absolutely impressive to see. And one of the cool things around that is that we end up actually having a little walk that often gets established early season, so you can actually walk out on the sea ice because it's plenty thick enough, and you go around, and often there'll be holes at the bottom of that ice where it's usually a little less thick, and so that's often where the seals will actually come up out and end up having these what I call melt pools. So that's the salt water as it's essentially going back to being water again.
Yeah, so I think if we look at sea ice from its formation, from just generally really cold water into what eventually becomes sea ice, it goes through a bunch of different stages. So it starts essentially when the ocean temperature gets to a point and is calm enough that essentially the temperature of the top layer drops, and it does begin to start forming these little ice crystals, and sometimes it's called grease ice, sometimes it's called frazzle ice, but eventually it forms these tiny little crystals that over time grow and grow and grow. Eventually you get to the point where the ice crystals are big enough and they form these little clumps, and that's called pancake ice. And the pancake ice then tends to sort of float around, and it's trying to find its place, and it's bashing into other little bits of pancake ice, and they end up sort of smashing together, and as temperatures continue to cool, they end up clumping together and they form these larger little sheets of ice, not to be confused with ice sheets, but these little segments that stick together and ultimately form the basis and the foundation of what will become sea ice. Once it all starts to join together, the only real change is it starts increasing in thickness as the temperatures cool down. But once that sheet is formed solid, hopefully it's held tight to some land or up against some other terrain features, and then it just starts to increase in depth.
Yeah, cool. And interesting you touch on land features there, and one of the things that you don't really even consider until you get down to Antarctica is this idea of what they call the polynya. And a polynya, in simple terms, is essentially where you end up having a high point in the underneath the water, in the water, and the currents that go over the top of that mean that it creates a narrower point between that point and the bottom of the sea ice. And so invariably what that will occur is an eddying of currents underneath the particular piece of ice, and so often we'll see in certain locations these holes opening up right in the sea ice in summer. So often they'll be in the exact same spot year on year, and so we know, okay, that's a polynya that happens every year. It's not an early breakup of the sea ice, or it's not something to be concerned about. It's just something that naturally occurs due to the fact that the underwater topography is very different as well.
Yeah, I've heard these polynyas be referred to as a sea ice factory, because it is those types of areas where sea ice, it does form, but generally the ice is not kept there, so it'll form and then be pushed out to different areas. So it's almost like it's just farming through. It's growing and then disappearing. It's growing and disappearing. It's growing and disappearing, and that cycle just continues, which is quite an interesting thing. And really, it's cool science to understand. We'll have to get someone on the show to talk to us about polynyas and sea ice growth and development.
Absolutely. And I guess one thing to note is that Antarctica's size overall, when you end up taking into consideration the seasonal sea ice, it almost doubles the surface area essentially of the coverage that Antarctica has. So it can be a very vast amount of sea ice. You think, we've spoken before about the size of Antarctica being as big as it is, twice the size of Australia, and so to think that now all of a sudden that doubles again towards the end of winter as the sea ice gets to its maximum. But interestingly, once we end up getting through the end of the winter period, which is when it continues on growing right the way through sort of that spring period, but once it starts getting that 24-hour sun particularly on it, it starts warming up pretty quick and starts deteriorating, right?
Yeah, that's another interesting part, and is one of the things that scientists are super interested in. So once that sea ice has grown, there's a whole massive area of really light, really white ice that's sitting on top of the ocean that typically would be a darker colour. There's a word to describe the sunlight hitting that additional level of ice and then reflecting back up into space, and it's called albedo. It essentially means that because the ice is so light and white, it's not absorbing as much heat as something darker colour, like a black or a dark blue like the ocean would. So this is helping particularly to really cool the planet down, because the sunlight's coming in and it's hitting the ice. Some of it's being absorbed, of course, but the rest of it bounces back off into space. And had that area just been open ocean, it'd be absorbing a lot more of that heat, which is why scientists are quite concerned about sea ice loss. It's because as this shrinks and shrinks, there's less area for that sunlight to reflect off, and it's just going to exacerbate that cycle and keep it going. So sea ice growth is really important to the cooling of our planet, which is something that people are really interested in.
Yeah, definitely.
Funnily enough, you speak about icebergs, and we were talking about those before, and back in 2006 there was an iceberg that was so large that ended up making its way up to the coast of New Zealand, and it was off the coast of Dunedin for quite some time, and people were using it as a bit of a tourism destination. I think there was a helicopter that flew out there. I'm pretty sure there was a sheep. Yeah, Shrek the sheep got shorn on this iceberg from Antarctica, and that was crazy. It was all over the news in New Zealand. I was living in Australia at that point in time, and I saw that thinking, these Kiwis are crazy. That is just the most bizarre thing that I would ever think to do. But there were journalists that were going out towards it on ships and reporting on this iceberg that had floated up from New Zealand, which was pretty spectacular. That's really interesting, though, in that people often say, Antarctica's so far away, what does it mean to me? I can't see it, so I don't know what's going on there. But really, if you think about it, Antarctica and New Zealand and Antarctica and the rest of the world are connected through the oceans, and you see that, and it manifests in icebergs turning up on the coast of New Zealand. That people, that was a really interesting thing for people to connect to Antarctica and say, you know what, this place is actually closer than we think, and we need to look after it, which is cool.
And that it matters, right? It kind of puts it all back into perspective, for sure, which
definitely
is good. Another one that we haven't mentioned yet is the likes of the Erebus glacier tongue, and there's a lot of glacier tongues down. The Drygalski is obviously one of the bigger ones.
The big one,
yeah. What's a glacier tongue? How does that kind of fit into the picture? Do you know?
So a glacier tongue is essentially just an ice shelf, but smaller. I think it's just the terminus of a glacier that keeps going, rather than a whole culmination of lots of ice flowing into this one area. It's just a glacier that sticks out and floats on the top of the ocean.
And the interesting thing there is that it is actually in the ocean. So when you it's quite bizarre when we end up going out there, say early season, when we travel out on the sea ice, and you come up to this glacier tongue, and you're just like, the shaping of it's quite different. So where often you'll see a glacier terminal face being, quite an abrupt end, these glacier tongues, they often end up having a more deformed side. So it looks more like kind of like a bread knife of sorts, or something like that on both sides, and that's largely in part because you've got almost this water erosion thing happening on both sides all the time. So it's quite a different prospect rather than a land-based glacier that you just see the terminal face there. The fact that it sticks out into the ocean gives it some pretty interesting characteristics.
Yeah, every time I see that from above, I liken it to the nose of a swordfish. It's got those little points on the side of it. That's kind of what it looks like, extending off the coastline.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Nice. And the other one is we've mentioned before around volcanoes and things like that, but fumaroles or fumaroles. So that's obviously the steam as it comes out. Different type of ice that's not actually glacier or fresh ice as such, but obviously the steam and the humidity that's around the volcano as that comes up through these little vents and chutes. Often they can form these little tunnels, and some pretty cool things around that as well. So all sorts.
There's some interesting features that exist within the different types of ice. So if you look at glaciers and things, you quite often have crevassing, which is essentially just a big gap or a void in between two blocks of ice, and they're typically formed when the ice is, let's say, flowing over a piece of land, and then that causes the ice to buckle and opens up these big gaps in there. So crevassing is something that we're pretty conscious of, particularly when we're traveling over glaciated terrain, but just another little interesting feature there. Often,
like, you think, the big big ice mass of Antarctica, it must all be flat and it must all be just, you're safe as you go for it, but it's not the case at all. When you end up having this dynamic piece of ice that's constantly moving, and at the South Pole, they have to reset the geographic South Pole marker every year because there's constantly this movement happening, and out to the coast it's even more pronounced. So it's something that we are very mindful of, and we relocate whole structures, and the airport got moved a couple of years ago simply because it's getting a bit close to that terminal face, and we know that if we don't do it now, it's going to be in another 3 or 4 years we're going to be getting even that much closer to it. So some pretty interesting things happen with that constant dynamic movement of the ice.
Yeah, and with that it creates some pretty cool things. So inside the glacier tongue that we were talking about before, there's often caves that form towards the end, and we're lucky enough that we can go and visit some of these and go inside and actually see the inner workings of a glacier. And often there are stalactites or icicles that are hanging from the roof of these caves, and just looking up at those, it's pretty special to see those.
Yeah, and going into a crevasse as well, right? Like actually spelunking essentially, or coming down from the top, and it's a pretty awesome thing to see as well. And a similar way as far as a lot of those real delicate ice crystals, and you sort of, the moment you breathe on them, they're gone. So it just sort of speaks to that fragility of the place.
Absolutely. Okay, I think that brings us to the end of our little chat on ice. Again, we're not ice experts, but this is just to give a broader idea of the different types of ice and what they mean. And often the terminology can get confusing between people, even those that work down in Antarctica and are quite familiar with it. So it's nice just to highlight that there are different types of ice and they mean different things. And hopefully this has given you a bit of a better understanding of what the different types of ice that we get in Antarctica are. That's it for today's episode of the Everything Antarctica podcast. Thanks for listening. If you want to find out more about us as hosts, you can find us on Instagram at Maddie K. Jordan and at Johnny Harrison NZ. We're also on socials. You can find us at Everything Antarctica. This episode will be released on all streaming platforms, and the long form video will be found on YouTube. Check us out wherever you listen to your podcasts.
If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a 5-star rating. This will really help us in our mission to make this podcast as good as it possibly can be. Please share this episode with your friends and social networks so we can spread the word to more people.
Until next time, stay cool.